A lot of people are curious about how we overwinter the keeper's hive. Maybe they have one and they're thinking about what they're going to do going into winter. Maybe they don't have one and they've seen the product and they're just not sure how it works. So I was thinking today would be a good opportunity for us to sort of rehash some of the stuff we've talked about on our channel before,
Sure.
but maybe try to do it all in a little bit of a longer video, but just to give everyone the full picture of not just sort of the hive configuration for winter, but also just some general winterizing concepts that maybe some people aren't familiar with. Because I certainly have just still been learning a lot about what it takes to overwinter hives from you just this season, from working with you this season. So, yeah, why don't we start with number one, the big one, because I know you've said this before. A lot of people worry about starvation. With starvation, that's something that the beekeeper can manage and prevent 100% of
Correct.
the time, in theory, like
Right.
100% of the time.
There's two reasons why bees die in the winter: disease and starvation,
Right.
basically.
And starvation we can control. Disease we can control a little bit. Do you want to talk a little bit about fall mite treatments and kind of like winter bees and why controlling mites over the summer, even before now, is important for winter survival?
Right. So you're going to have a cluster of bees that are going to survive the winter, hopefully. And that cluster of bees is going to be somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 bees that are going to exist in your hive through the winter. And those bees are being made now in September and October, and they're called the winter bees. And those bees have to be healthy. You have to have so many of those bees to survive, and those bees have to be healthy. And the best way to make sure your bees are healthy is basically to control your mites. So it's getting late in the season if you've not done anything about your mites yet, but that is an important piece of overwintering, is to have healthy bees, which generally means to control your mites throughout the year. So we have so if your bees are healthy, they're unlikely to die in the winter because of a health related thing. The most common reason why they would die would be starvation. They'd run out of food because there's nothing blooming in most parts of the country in the winter. So whatever honey or whatever carbohydrate sources they have in their hive going into winter is what they're going to need to survive on until the flowers start blooming again in the spring.
Right. Okay. So yeah, so if you're interested in the mite treatments we've used or we recommend using with the hive, all of them work, but we have another video. Definitely check that out on mites. So then another question, George, is when should you start winterizing the hives? Like based on, let's say, maybe not month of the year, but based on your weather, your local weather.
Yeah, so I would say for us in southeastern Pennsylvania, for me, I need to have everything done on my hive before the end of October to make sure that that hive is going to survive the winter. And that is dependent on our local weather conditions, right? So once you get nighttime frost or daytime temperatures, say less than 55 degrees, it's getting too late to do much to your hive to help it survive the winter. So your winter prep is really done in the fall and not the winter.
Right. And so a common question we get, and I think a common thing out there for a lot of people's management, is fall feeding. Can
Sure.
you talk a little bit about fall feeding and how to time it?
Right. So there are two reasons to fall feed, and they're slightly different reasons in how you go about doing it. Some people fall feed to increase the number of bees that are going to go through the winter. So they want to increase the winter bee production. So those people generally are feeding earlier in the fall, like say end of August or beginning of September, because they're trying to boost the bee population. And they're feeding generally 1-to-1 syrup at that time. And again, the goal of that feeding is not necessarily to make the hive have more stores for winter. It's basically to increase the bee numbers going into winter. So that's reason number one. Reason number two to feed in the fall is because they're a little bit light on honey and you're concerned that they're going to run out of honey through the winter. So you want to make sure they have enough carbohydrate sources to survive the winter. And that type of feeding is generally started about 2 to 3 weeks before that time when I say everything should be done. So 2 to 3 weeks before you get a lot of nighttime frost and daytime temperatures less than 55 degrees, you're going to start feeding 2-to-1 syrup, more concentrated syrup that the bees have an easier time drying out. And they're not going to take that syrup and use it to make bees. They're going to take that syrup and store it away so they don't run out of food in the fall. So one feeding is 1-to-1 to make bees earlier in the fall, and the other syrup is 2-to-1 to increase honey stores so that they don't run out of food in the winter. And you may not need to do either of those depending on the situation, the state of your hive going into fall. If you have a hive that has lots of bees and lots of honey, there's no need to feed.
Right. Okay. And then so let's talk about how the keeper's hive compares in terms of the number of frames it overwinters on. You can do it in multiple ways. You'll go into that to standard Langstroth hives, because I think sometimes people look at it and they think it's really different from a traditional Langstroth hive. But I think if you just talk about single brood chamber overwintering, that's something that a lot of people do know about, or some know about, and it's the exact same concept.
Right. So if you take a traditional Langstroth hive, whether or not it be 8-frame or 10-frame, there's basically three ways three box configurations that you can overwinter that hive. You can overwinter it in 2 deeps or 3 mediums, so that would be equivalent to 2 deeps or 3 mediums. And that configuration would be 20 deep frames or 30 medium frames. And that hive, if fully full of honey or syrup, could weigh 150 pounds, right? So that's one configuration. The next configuration is you could have 1 deep and a medium, or 2 mediums, and that is a deep and a half. So you basically have a deep and then 1 medium full of honey, and that hive would probably weigh about 90 or 100 pounds. And I don't like that configuration because when the bees the cluster moves up in the winter, they're basically moving up into medium frames, and I use my mediums for honey and my deeps for brood. So it's a little bit of sorting out in the spring when you got your brood up on your medium frames, but it works quite well. It's a very common configuration that people overwinter in. The last configuration that you'd overwinter in is basically a single deep or 2 medium boxes. And that would be a configuration where it's just basically 8 or 10 frame deep box. And that box probably could hold between 60 or 70 pounds of weight on it. And that's the one that's not commonly used, but that's how I overwinter most of my Langstroth hives in southeast Pennsylvania, because I believe that amount of food is enough to get them through the winter. So however you're overwinter, and if you have more than 2 deeps or 3 mediums, you probably have too much space on your hive, honestly. That you don't need that much space or that much food for the bees to survive the winter. And you may be doing them a bit of a disservice by having such a big hive for the cluster through the winter. So again, that's a traditional Langstroth winter configuration. And the keeper's hive is basically a Langstroth, right? So we basically have the same, we have a single brood chamber, which is 8 frames. And then you have the ability to overwinter in a single and a medium nuke box, a single and a deep nuke box, or just a single in itself. So it's pretty much the same
number of
frames, essentially. It's a little bit less because these are 5 frames and not 10 frames above, but it's the same whether or not you're going to go overwinter in a single or whether or not you're going to overwinter in a double or a single and a half.
Right. Because you can remove the queen excluder and put honey frames in those boxes above. You could add extra boxes if you wanted to. Like you said, we don't in southeastern PA.
Right.
Let's talk about that. So this is something that I just learned about. Talk about the amount of honey consumed while they're in the cluster versus the amount of honey consumed when they start to brood up in the spring. Because I always just thought, oh, if there's 30 pounds of honey in the hive, they're just eating the same amount all the time. But that's actually not the case.
Right. So at some point, at least in most areas of the country where we are, the queen stops laying. Some point, for us, it's the end of October, beginning of November, the queen will stop laying, and the colony is not making brood anymore. When the colony's not making brood, there's 2 things that are going to result that's going to happen. One is that the temperature in the hive is going to fall. So instead of needing to maintain the temperature at 92 degrees, now they only need to maintain the temperature at 65 or 70 degrees. So the temperature is going to go down, and they don't have all the mouths of all these larvae to feed either, right? So there's no young bees to raise, so they don't need to spend food on feeding young, and they don't need to spend food on heating the hive. So the winter consumption of carbohydrates or honey when they're in the cluster without brood is only about 3, maybe 4 pounds of honey a month they consume. Now that is assuming that you don't have a giant cluster in your hive and that you kind of don't have a lot of heat loss going on in your hive. But if your hive is optimally configured with about 7 frames of bees in your winter cluster, that colony is only going to consume 3 or 4 pounds of honey a month until they start to make brood again, right? So at some point, the bees are going to decide the queen needs to start laying again. We need to start making bees again. So when the spring comes, we have enough bees to do what we need to do. And that the start of that process happens sometime in winter, right? So in Southeast Pennsylvania, that happens like the 3rd or 4th week of January. And it probably happens in different times based on your latitude. But at that point, 2 things happen. One thing happens is that they need to raise the brood nest temperature to 92 degrees because that's what the brood needs to survive. And they also need to start feeding larvae. So the amount of food consumption goes up 3-fold when that happens. So instead of 3 pounds a month, now they're consuming 10 pounds a month, right? So that's when the winter consumption really starts to kick in, is when the queen starts to lay again. And then they're going to consume, and then the hope is that they're consuming whatever winter stores they have, and then sometime in March around here, or maybe earlier down south or later up north, the spring nectar flow is going to start. The early flowers are going to start to bloom, and they're going to be bringing in new nectar sources, and they'll go back to being okay and not needing their winter stores. It's that time period that's sort of late in winter where most colonies are at risk of starvation because of the increased honey consumption that's happening then.
Right. And you mentioned at one point to me that for us, the reason it maybe happens at the end of January is because that coincides with being 6 weeks in advance of the start of the flow.
Correct.
Or the start of bloom.
Right.
So that 6 weeks is how long it takes for foragers to get made, or
it takes 21 days for the worker
right.
and then 3 weeks for the worker to become a forager.
Right,
so 3 weeks to develop that bee, and 3 weeks to become a forager. So that's 6-week window. So the end of January, 6 weeks from the end of January is the middle of March, and that's when our nectar and pollen sources start to come out. So the bees have it figured out. Like, they start at the end of January to have a workforce ready for the middle of March.
Right. So someone who's on a different weather schedule might be able to use that as some kind of gauge for.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe don't hold us to that. But that's how it's worked for us. But,
yeah, about 6 weeks before the pollen and the early spring pollen and nectar starts, that's usually when the queen starts to
right.
lay.
So to your point though about, let's say, if basically the monthly consumption while they're in the cluster form and they're not feeding brood, you said you've weighed your hives.
Correct.
And they've lost 3 pounds.
3 pounds a month.
And that's in Pennsylvania where it can get cold.
Correct.
So for somebody who maybe doesn't believe that, like you said, part of it could be size of cluster, top ventilation, size of the hive. There's some elements there. But so can you talk about why you feel, well, I mean, there are a lot
Why am I crazy? Yeah.
No. Well, the concept makes a lot of sense. Like, people overwinter in singles in Canada and the Midwest. I know people raise nukes or overwinter nukes in wooden boxes in the Midwest. But there's also a lot of people out there who live in maybe areas that are even more temperate than the Midwest and think they need a poly hive to make it through the winter.
Right.
Or they need 80 pounds of honey to make it through the winter.
Right.
So there's clearly a discrepancy between those two modes of thought. So can you talk about the ventilation and the smaller space and how that might affect metabolism?
Right. So when I started with beekeeping, I was taught a hive needs to weigh 100 to 120 pounds to make it through the winter. It just needs to, right? If your hive doesn't weigh 100 to 120 pounds, it's not going to make it. Now I'm thinking if my hive weighs 70 pounds, it's going to make it. So there's obviously a 50-pound difference in there about. So why am I so confident? Well, I, I sort of like if I want them to consume less fuel for the winter, I've got to minimize their heat loss, right? First, right? So, and the way I do that is a couple things going into winter. One is I run all solid bottom boards. If I run screen bottom boards, I would definitely put the insert in, and I would probably put some insulation underneath the insert again to minimize the heat loss coming down from the hive. Um, on the top of the hive, I don't have any top ventilation. So on the top of the hive, I would take my inner cover and turn it so the notch up instead of the notch down. So the bees have no way of getting out the top, but there's also no heat loss from the top. And then I add a 2-inch piece of foam board insulation above that, and then the lid on top. So basically what I've done is I also run them in singles. So I've condensed all the bees down into one spot. They don't need to move. Probably the CO2 levels in that single rise nicely. So that helps the torpor and decreases the metabolism. I basically stopped any heat loss from below, stopped any heat loss from above. And I'm with that prep, I'm confident that my bees are going to, I've done what I can do to minimize their heat loss through the winter and therefore their consumption. I do not wrap or use poly hives, but again, if you increase your insulation around your hive, that would also probably help decrease the amount of food consumption they need to get. So I basically have created a hive environment where the heat loss is minimal, and their ability to build up CO2 is great. They decrease their metabolism, and their need to consume sugar is really low until they start making brood.
Right.
That's the goal.
Right. And so I know like you have successfully overwintered hives that way for several years now, maybe many years now.
Many years, yeah.
You do sometimes add supplemental feed in the spring if they seem like they need it, but for the most part, you've been doing it this way and it's worked really well.
Yeah, I think sometimes I do get anxious and nervous a little bit coming out of winter into that spring, that sort of
February,
that late February, early March period, where if I know the hive was a little bit on the lighter side going into winter, I would probably be adding some fondant or solid sugar to help them get through the winter that way.
Right.
Maybe unnecessarily so, but I don't want to see any colonies starve because I've not added enough to their feed for the winter.
Right.
But that would be the time. You can put fondant on in December, but if your hive is that light in December, you got problem. You got serious. You have serious light hive in December, right?
Right.
If you do need that emergency food, you really shouldn't need that fondant until later on in the winter, early spring.
Right. Okay. So yeah, so the time to watch out, like starvation is actually more likely in a light hive. It's more likely to happen late in the winter than early in the winter.
Correct.
Okay.
And while disease will kill your colony earlier
Sooner
in the winter.
because the winter bees will have virus.
Be sick and not be able to generate the heat, and they'll just sort of dwindle and die.
Right. Okay. So then let's talk more specifically about the configuration of the one queen keeper. We're going to show a 2 queen keeper after this, but you just kind of showed a little bit of how you do it, but that actually isn't the configuration you overwinter in. Can you show like how you get it down to 8 frames or what you do?
So the
or explain it. You don't have to.
Yeah, no, I can show you briefly. So so there's basically with the one queen keeper, you have 2 options of, at least for me, there's 2 options on how to overwinter, right? So the first option is an option where you're overwintering it with basically just you have 8 frames in your brood chamber, and you basically have an empty medium spacer box. So the only frames in the hive that are going to go through the winter are 8 in the brood chamber, and you're not going to have any frames above. So this is basically a single deep overwintering configuration, right? So
single 8-frame deep.
Single 8-frame deep overwinter. You want to make sure that there's enough resources down here to survive. So this is a hive, like I talked about, feeding 2 to 1 in October. If you don't have a lot of honey down here, you may want to put some mason jars up into here and feed 2 to 1 in October to have them put on an extra 10 or 20 pounds as an assurance. But if you have 5 or 6 frames of honey down here in your brood chamber, you're probably going to be okay. So this is the single deep.
You remove the queen excluder.
I'm going to show you that. Yeah. Okay. So I would remove the queen excluder. I would leave the medium box like so. These latches are adjustable, so you can tighten them down. So this will be, and then I would get a piece of 3/4 inch foam board insulation and put it over the window like this. And then I would get my inner cover like this. I would put my insulation up here. And then this box, this basically becomes a feeding shim, a very tall feeding shim, but it basically becomes a feeding shim. If, per se, I'm a little concerned about their food resources, I can come up here and add some fondant or sugar bricks right onto the frames, and that's my feeding shim basically.
Right.
And that's configuration.
And in that configuration, when the spring comes, all you really have to do is take that medium nuke. We call it the spacer box because of the demery, but
put the frames back in it.
Yeah, to take that medium nuke off, put the queen excluder back on.
Yep.
And put the frames back in it.
Correct.
And you're good.
And you're good to go when you're ready to do your first demery when they get crowded down there.
Right.
So that's option number 1. This is how I overwinter pretty much all the 1 queen keepers in my neck of the woods, just as a single 8-frame deep single brood chamber, using the medium spacer box as a feeding shim, insulation at the top, insulation underneath the window, no top ventilation, solid bottom board, good to go.
Mouse guard.
Mouse guard. Yeah, so you want to not have any entrances that are bigger than 3/8 of an inch, so that may be okay. I have my own mouse guard that I put 3/8 inch channels, so I don't want mice getting in. They sell mouse guards, but you want a mouse guard on the front too.
Right.
So that's configuration number 1. Configuration number 2 is
similar, but it's the deep instead of the medium, right?
But it's the deep here that function as your...
It's on top of the insulation. There you go.
That function as your exchange box. So, right, the exchange box is sitting at the top of the hive. It's probably full of honey. You can make a decision whether or not you want to harvest that honey or whether or not you want to leave that honey for the bees.
Right. That's just to in case anybody's just tuning in for the first time. The exchange box is a term we use for the demery method of swarm control, which this hive is really sort of almost designed around to an extent. Like, basically, you can prevent swarming in the 8-frame single brood chamber by moving brood frames up to a deep box toward the top of the hive. They hatch out, it backfills with honey. So George is saying, if you don't want that honey that's had brood in it, just feed it to the bees at the end of the year, right? That's
pretty much. If you want to, give them a little more honey above them, and you don't want to harvest that honey, or you don't need that harvest honey, leave that honey for the bees, basically. Right. So we have 5 deep frames in a deep nuke box, which is 30 pounds of honey up here, plus whatever honey's in their brood chamber, and that will clearly be enough to help them survive the winter. And then you would put the same...
Right, everything else is kind of the same, right?
The only difference on this configuration is, I don't have one with me today, but I would often...
It doesn't need to be clamped.
It doesn't need... You could put a nuke size shim up here,
okay,
just in case.
Oh, if there's frames in it and you want to add feed on top.
And you want to add, if for some reason you want to add feed on top of these 5 frames, you can put a 1.5 inch shim up here, and then put your fondant up here if you would like. And again, the same
The top is the same.
You would do the same top with the notch facing up, so no ventilation going out the top. Your 2-inch foam insulation board like this, and then this on top. So what's going to happen in this configuration is that the bees are going to start down here in the winter, and then they're going to slowly migrate up to here. And coming out of winter, your bees will be up here, and then you basically will take these bees and bring them down.
Just move the frames down.
Move the frames down, put the queen excluder back in, and go. Either one works well. I've done both. They both have their advantages, and it just depends on how much honey you want to harvest. And
well, maybe somebody who's got a much longer winter than we do, like if your winter's twice as long as ours,
sure,
maybe you want to have a little extra.
Right.
You can add. Basically, you're free to add more frames.
Yeah, and you know, if you don't have 5 frames of honey, you could still put this box on and then put a feeder in it and feed it up in the fall so that they have food in these frames. So there's nothing that stops you from whatever configuration that you're using to put a feeder in and feed some 2 to 1 in the fall to bring them up a little bit of weight. You know?
Right.
But they both work. So that's the options for the winter for the 1 queen keeper.
Okay. I can't think of any more questions at the moment. Did you think I covered everything?
I think so. I mean,
if you guys have any questions, put them in the comments.
Put them in the comments and
send us an email, whatever you want to do. But we'll talk about the 2 queen now. I will say the 2 queen is same concept.
Same concepts.
It's the 2 queen keeper is 2 1 queen keepers back to back, divided up to that point on the hive. Right?
Correct.
They share honey supers, which are not divided, but up until this height on the hive, it's divided.
And we'll show you, but it's the same consideration. Do you just want to overwinter in a single, or do you want to overwinter in a single plus 5 above? And that's that's up to you.
So we'll be right back, and we'll have a 2 queen keeper.
So again, we're going to talk about how to get the 2 queen keeper through the winter really quick. And again, it's the same discussion. You have to make a decision whether or not you want to overwinter just with 8 in the brood chamber, or you want to do 8 in the brood chamber and 5 deep above. I've done both. They both work. You just have to make that decision. So getting this ready for winter, again, you're going to take off your this box. You're going to take off your queen excluder, and you're going to put this box back on. And you want to make sure that you don't rotate it 90 degrees, because these bees are to this side and those bees are to that side. So you don't want to spin it 90 degrees and have the wrong bees on the wrong side. So just take it off, just put it back the same way. And then if you were going to overwinter basically with just 8 in the brood chamber, you're going to take out the 5 frames in here, and this deep right here is going to be basically a tall feeding shim, where you're going to be able to in the fall, you can put mason jars up here and feed it liquid until that temperature gets too cold. And once it gets cold, if you need some extra feed coming out of winter, you could put fondant up there. So that's option 1, and you would basically do that on both sides. Option number 2 is when you're going to leave you're going to leave the 5 deep frames in here. So the bees are going to be able to move up from the bottom up to the top. And then at the top of the hive, you're going to put your inner cover.
You do have to be mindful of that hole and any gap.
Yeah.
Depending on your inner cover, there may be a gap there that the bees could get through.
Correct.
So they are divided at the bottom of that box. There's a divider that keeps them completely sealed at the bottom. Depending on your setup at the top, you may have to add a small strip of something, or depending on your inner cover.
Depending on your inner cover, how much of a gap there is on the inner cover. If your inner cover is flat on one end, you should be fine.
Right. And
then I put the queen excluder just up above here. And then your 2-inch foam board, and then your outer cover. So you basically are going to overwinter with 8 over 5. Now we have a, if you're going to overwinter with 5 and you want to have that feeding shim, we do have going to have a divided feeding shim available. That's basically just going to sit right up on top there, and it's going to allow you to put some fondant on both sides, and also have a relatively secure way of preventing the bees from crossing over at the top. So this is going to be a way if you want to put some extra feed at the top. So you would have your feeding shim. Again, you would have your inner cover, notch facing up, so no top ventilation, your 2-inch foam board, and your outer cover like this. And again, in the winter, in this configuration, your bees are going to start up here, move up here, and in the spring, you're going to take them back down and add the queen excluder back again. So this is the 2 ways to overwinter the 2 queen keeper.
Right.
Now, people have asked if I only have one side, if I only have bees on one side of the 2 queen keeper, can it overwinter? Absolutely. I mean, you don't need to put anything on the other side to have one side overwinter. One side is essentially a 1 queen keeper.
Right.
So
right.
You can definitely overwinter with only one colony in one side.
Okay. Cool. Thank you, George.
Yeah, I hope that was helpful. It takes a season or two before it sort of becomes routine, but everyone will get it, and it's really not that hard. You just have to make a decision whether or not you want to overwinter in a single, or whether or not you want to overwinter with a single and 5 above on both the 1 and 2 queen keeper. Right. And at least in Southeast Pennsylvania, they both work.
Right. Great.
Thanks, everybody.
Let us know if you have questions or comments. Thanks again.